welcome wargamers back to the dark, miserable depths of Necromunda. It's been a bit since I've tapped back into the lore here, but I'm so excited to share some stories today because we're finally talking about the coolest house that there is, House Goliath. Also known as the House of Chains. The gangs that make up House Goliath are genetically engineered, right? The backs that carry the hive through incredible acts of physical labor. They have a wonderfully unique history, and I'm so excited to jump into it today. Before we hop in that way, we're going to hop into our way back machine and ask the basic question, what is a Goliath ganger? Because their story, much more than the other gangs, has a specific birthing point in history. Well, there's a bit of an ongoing debate about what exactly the Goliaths, as we know them now, are. They haven't been officially labeled as like abhumans, meaning a true genetic offshoot of humanity, but they are allowed to exist under the watchful eye of the Necromunda governor. Each Goliath ganger stands incredibly tall, is wreathed in powerful muscles, can survive in the deadliest of environments, but as with everything, there is a cost. In this case, these workers are cursed with very short lifespans, even by Necromunda standards, and lower than normal intelligence, but it must be said, they have a primal cunning to them nonetheless. Now at the moment, there are essentially three different kinds of Goliath gang members. Vat-born, those who are genetically engineered, raised in huge tanks, vats if you will, that accelerate their development. They're taught only the most basic instructions for labor through like mental implants and psycho-indoctrination, and they're forced to live this life of like mindless labor. And because there's so much drug stimulant and rapid growth and all these kinds of like, intense developments, they only have a lifespan of about 10 years. They need near constant stim injections, their physiology being a complicated balance of artificial and natural chemicals that keep them going. But no matter what, their bodies will eventually give out, as there's only so much that any living thing can take. Now the second of these are what they call the Nat-born, which is a shortening way of saying the naturally born. These are still massive, hulking gang members that are, again, naturally born, rather than being made in a vat. And we'll get to why this class is so important to the gang, but there's three notable things about the Nat-born that stand out. They have longer lifespans, somewhat higher intelligence, and they're not, as opposed to the Vat-born, sterile. They can produce children. This is where they start to become an actual a race that has progeny, a genetic lineage within the 40k universe. The third and last category of Goliath are known as the unborn. These are essentially normal folks, willing or unwilling, that are injected with all kinds of chemicals and all kinds of stimulants and stuff, and they're morphed and twisted into the same hulking beings that make up the rest of the gang. Now, to an outsider, they all look pretty much the same in terms of size and muscularity and that kind of stuff. Anyone can really suss out, exactly what a Goliath ganger is, but internally, every Goliath member can tell exactly which one of these three categories each other is by that glance, right? It's the micro changes that come from the various methods that they become Goliath members. So us on the outside, we would look and say, oh, look, there's 10 Goliath members and not see really a noticeable difference. But someone in the gang would be able to look around them and be like, you're Nat-born, you're Vat-born, all that kind of stuff. And while that explains what they are, it doesn't answer the question of how they got there. You see, well, in the grim darkness of the far future in the 40k universe, automation is either rarely trusted or viewed as straight up heretical. And I don't mean like artificial intelligence, I mean like mechanical automation for like factories and that kind of stuff. Which means that all of those factories, to have this endless supply of munitions and technology, everything that's being built, is usually managed by the teeming masses. The Imperium is built upon the labor and suffering of its trillions of citizens. And while this is not an issue for them morally, right, or anything to change, it does still leave room for improvement, because there are some jobs that the average person simply cannot do. Environments that are too harsh, tools that are too heavy, and so on. So, one of the many Necromunda lords, Helmar from long ago, Helmar is the last name of the current governor, but it's also like a long lineage of them. He set out to change things, and he pulled together the scientific knowledge of House Van Zar and the pharmaceutical expertise of House Escher and demanded they work together to perform a single task. Make me a better worker. A new kind of, manual labor. And they came at this from a few different angles, right? Van Zar, as we've mentioned in their video, has been working with kind of flesh crafting stuff for a while, growing organs and sometimes even trying out cloned bodies, because they themselves, as we mentioned in their video, are constantly bombarded with radiation sickness and all these kinds of things. So they're already kind of working down this one very physical avenue in terms of the structure and nature of a human body. As for the Escher gang, we also have a video on them. They have a history of developing more and more complex stimulants, right? Pharmaceuticals, drugs, enhancements, stims, pushing the human body further and further through chemical means rather than necessarily surgical. Now, of course, these two factions are not friends, right? Half the time in the streets, they would just as likely light each other up with gunfire as they would work together. But ultimately, when in Necromunda, in that environment, that ecosystem that I constantly talk about, of all these gangs having to work together, when the boss makes a demand, you do it. You have to do it, because he owns you, right? And so all of a sudden, these two houses, which just want to see each other dead, are put inside of a group project, and hey, in the 41st millennium, everyone still hates group projects. And while they do work together, there's a lot of hints about sabotage on each side. Because if you're the one who cracks the code and you're say you're the Van Zar guys do it, we made the best, worker ever, and the Eschers didn't even help at all, obviously that's going to raise their social standing and their influence. And because they're both thinking that way, they're trying to use this as an opportunity to gain something, right? Escher wants to create the perfect, strong, indestructible worker so that they can have stronger male breeding stock. And Van Zar wants more research into the body in terms of aging and radiation immunity and all those kinds of things. There's much to gain for both of them, but they will not work together willingly. However, at the end of the day, they did it. Now, obviously, it was longer than a day. It was quite a while, but you know what I mean. A colossal, muscle-bound humanoid, strong enough to lift hundreds of pounds, endure truly inhospitable conditions, and work nearly endless hours. They're big, they're strong, and most importantly, quite dumb. Because the creators of this new take on humanity used intelligence as a sort of leash. They were initially all vat grown. There was only vat born. So just some material in a vat, it was aged rapidly, produced in near assembly line fashion, as if they were just another piece of equipment. Each one was psychologically indoctrinated with just enough knowledge to function and do the job that they were manufactured to do. Again, intelligence is the leash. Then throughout their lives, they are constantly injected with all manner of drugs and stims that keep their bodies working at peak power, and it's the chemicals that made this mountain of living flesh possible. And all this extreme work and drug use essentially burns these guys out. Like we talked before, Vatborn are only going to last about 10 years, but if that 10 years sees them working harder than 5 normal guys who take up a lifetime of food and resources and all these things, that's absolutely a win. But unbeknownst to its creators, these Vatborn were growing. See, ever so slowly, they began to develop a sense of self, right? Leaving, handprints and markings to one another, and almost a way that they would generationally communicate with one another, and some sort of cleverness and something close to consciousness began to grow organically. And I just want to put in here that there is a big difference between intelligence, which is just, raw information and your ability to, kind of work through concepts and that kind of stuff. But cunning is different. You don't have to be smart to be cunning. because they were quite dim, but they could look around and see what was going on, the game that was being played, and how they, as pawns, fit into it. Now, this whole process of them growing and adapting and becoming, more, I guess, human in the sense, in the more like the psychological sense of having a sense of self, it takes quite a bit of time. And if you'll forgive me, I'm gonna yada 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 a little bit here and skip ahead, because at some point a moment comes where the brutish cunning of these Vatvorn reaches a fever pitch. A day of revolution comes up, and I freaking love how they do it, okay? So these guys are working in mines and forges located in the most inhospitable parts of the hive. It's like toxic, corrosive, and all these kinds of things. Normal guys would die in minutes, and they can handle it for quite a while. And so this slave uprising happens with the Goliath workers, and two things happen simultaneously, okay? Goliath people seize the mines, they seize these factories and all this kinds of stuff, so they have immediate leverage, okay? And that's super important in Necromunda. You have to have something to barter with. And they say, come and take it then, right? And that idea is, that the other gangs can't really go safely to where these locations are to reclaim them. So they literally take the most inhospitable places for themselves and come and get it, okay? And that's the first thing that happens. And secondly, this is my favorite, they keep working, okay? And that second thing to me is what shows the cunning. Because here's the deal. The planetary governors and rulers of Necromunda could not care less about who was working for them or below them. To them, these are all, as I like to use the term, dirt people, expendable as a resource. Every human is just a number on a page. All they care about is that the quota of production is met so that no one above them in the Imperium comes knocking on their door. You don't want the tax collector of the Imperium of Man to come to Necromunda and be like, you're not supplying enough, whatever the resource is. So, when this mining facility and all these factories, they change hands because of this uprising, but then output goes up because they're working harder for their freedom, they really could not care less. In fact, they're pumped. So in other civilizations where they would see maybe like a slave revolt, or no, this is so dangerous, we need to subjugate this, they're looking at this like, okay, well, they can still work, and now they can produce more. Well, why would we ever want to give this back to the old gang who had it before? Why even stop that? That's fantastic. Because knowing how to feed that bigger fish in this whole predatory like ecosystem of power that is Necromunda is the kind of cunning that I was talking about. You made me to mine ore? Well, if I want my freedom, I don't have to have a long, protracted battle for it. I don't have to eliminate you. I just need to prove to the bosses that I'm better at mining when I'm free. And the rest will happen naturally. And I just love that so much. And as this new strain of human grows, it takes on an identity. House Goliath. And while that's a name that's been used before by smaller gangs in history, it's the name that galvanizes all of these, this new kind of human and cements themselves as a meaningful part of the Necromunda ecosystem, which is kind of how I like to describe this. These gangs all having to work together and share resources, but they're all vying for power and backstabbing. The leash of limited intelligence is somewhat cast off, and while they don't suddenly become geniuses or anything like that, they get smarter as time goes on, and certainly they are much smarter than the time of their inception. Able to speak, reason, bargain, things like that, and while it might seem crazy, they still do the manufacturing of Vatborn Goliaths to this day because they understand something. Numbers matter, right? A show of force matters. And more bodies means more work, which means more validation from the people on top. And so even though they have cast off, being owned as property and other own people, they've kind of just subjugated themselves in a sense. They're still in chains. And I think that little note, when they keep doing the thing that, they were trying to break free from, but now they're doing it for themselves, is kind of like that little grim darkness where there's just not really a whole lot of bright future for them, but now they're doing it for themselves. And so from nothing, House Goliath has clawed its way up the chain of power, and while it's still a very small house comparatively, it has come to stand on its own 2 feet, doing the exact jobs they were made to do, but doing it for themselves as a newly formed people. And so at the end of every one of these videos, I like to just stop and ask the question, why is this cool, right? Why is this such an awesome story? Well, anything that has like small elite warriors and they're all super tough as nails absolutely grips me. I don't know why, it's just something I really like where, you know, there's horde armies and that kind of stuff and gangs that focus on how abundant human life is and kind of like valueless it is, but to have, you know, so much work and engineering put into these guys just makes them seem cool to me. It honestly kind of reminded me of the book, if you're familiar with it, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where people are manufactured in batches to grow up and do specific jobs, right? But I like the twist. It's not about freedom in the typical sense of like, you know, breaking the wheel and getting out of this system, because they don't stop making Vatborn, but it's about carving out an identity in a world that does not value it. They wanted to be their own people. They wanted to make the decisions, to pick the fights and all of that. Now, there's a ton of stuff I didn't cover just because with all of these videos, I want you to go read the book yourself. You know, go check out some of these Black Library novellas that feature Goliath gangers, as well as obviously the House of Chains book, which is just stellar, by the way. There's more political maneuvering, power grabbing. You know, Escher and Vanzar are very loath to see them as people. Of course, these are, you know, Frankenstein not wanting to acknowledge that he made his monster kind of a thing. And all of that adds up to make it a really compelling faction, and quite frankly, they have some of the coolest models in the range, and it's my biggest gang that I have collected by far. So let me know your thoughts. What do you think of House of Chains as a book, you know, House Goliath, the gangs of Goliath, all that kind of stuff? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to read them. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me, and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.